So here we go. The college football playoff, which featured a matchup, I don't know if you guys knew this or not, between Penn State and Notre Dame. The college football playoff could be getting some changes.
Very, very clear yesterday.
The SEC
really used as a weapon yesterday against
SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey, Big Ten Commissioner Tony Petitti agreed that there should be a change to the way the 12-team college football playoff teams are seeded, and the change should come this upcoming season. So for everybody out there that was bitching and moaning about, automatic qualifiers going to conference champions, whether it be, Arizona State getting a bye or the bye going to Boise State, don't worry, they've stepped up, and it looks like we could see a change coming up here pretty quick.
And what is that change? What does that represent?
Well, the change, I think, is going to be more in regards to the seeding of how they go about doing it, which I think most would agree. If the top 4 teams, the way they're ranked, however that falls out, those teams ultimately should be able to get the bye. And I think as far as how the rankings are awarded, it was a little bit confusing for some out there because they didn't really understand how the automatic qualifiers worked for the conference champions. And then when you had a team that was not within the autonomous 4, Power 4, call it what you will, in Boise State, who gets a bye, people were scratching their head going, wait a second, I didn't think that was possible. Or for example, the ACC champion, Clemson, who was outside of the top 12 in the rankings, they still obviously get an automatic bid into the playoff. And so people are like, that doesn't make any sense. So I think what you're going to see is a change in the seeding as far as how the teams 1 through 12 are going to be seeded once they get to the playoff. Now, it could, and by the way, it could be 1 through 14. It could be 1 through 16 at this point, which if it's 16, we don't have to worry about buys, or we shouldn't. We should make them all play. I would say this, though, is my biggest concern about where we are at with the college football playoff as it currently exists. If you start creating automatic qualifiers, what bothers me is this is not the NFL. And when I say that, I mean, we understand that winning your division is paramount. All right, a division's comprised of 4 teams. Well, look at how some of these super conferences are constructed. I mean, you have Big Ten with 18 teams? Maybe it stops there. Maybe it keeps growing. The SEC, et cetera. Big 12, ACC. And what we saw in year 1 was the difference sometimes in scheduling where a team like Indiana could potentially not have to really play anyone difficult outside of Ohio State. I guess you could throw Michigan in there, even though it was a down year for Michigan and they beat them. They got them at home. So credit to Coach Cignetti and crew. But that wasn't the best Michigan team we've seen, right? Clearly the top teams were Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, as far as that goes. And then Indiana, you'd probably say was somewhere after that. So the general point is that if you start creating automatic qualifiers for the Big Ten and the SEC, and really any other conference for that matter, it takes away from the games. Like you're like everyone knows the ending to the story, so it takes away from the intrigue of the regular season. Like to me, that's one of the greatest things about sports is the fact that your regular season has to matter. And if you're now basically saying that, well, the top 4 teams from the Big Ten will get in, the top 4 from the SEC will get in, it's like, well, okay, I mean, how really hard is your schedule going to be, as far as your non-conference? Do you need to schedule anyone tough anymore then? Or is it just about how you finish within your conference and how that works out and how those tie-breaking scenarios work out? So if they don't figure out a way for the final weekend, because ultimately what's being sacrificed is the conference championships. They're basically null and void because if there's an automatic qualifier, you'd almost rather not play. As long as the season is, you'd almost rather be able to get a break, get extra rest. And if you're Ohio State, for example, be able to prepare for that home first-round matchup versus Tennessee and then go on the rest of the way on a warpath to win a national championship. So I sit there and just say, we got to be careful. Because if some of the powers that be aren't, and they get a little too greedy, and I keep talking to you guys about how, well, you can do the math on this too. Think about this. If you get 4 guaranteed teams in from each one of those conferences every year, you're guaranteeing what your conference is at least being paid out through that first round, which is obviously important for those conferences continuing to separate themselves from the Big 12, from the ACC, from every other group of 5 conference that's out there. So in part, it's about money, and it always is. But the other portion of this is we can't sacrifice the sanctity of what has always been a regular season sport and the different ways we've kind of anointed our champion with the way we're going about looking at this playoff format. Like, that's what concerns me the most about some of the discussion about these automatic qualifiers.
So not the number of teams, it's the automatic qualifiers.
Here's what I'm curious about. If we're basing it off of the ratings, what you're rated is going to dictate where you're at. What rating are we using? Ranking. What ranking are we using? Are we using an AP? Which one are we using? Because to me, that has to be universal. If you have 3 different rankings and you have teams that are in different slots, then to me, that creates confusion. If you're not going to honor the fact that a team actually some way, somehow won their conference, if that's not going to be honored, I don't have a problem with that. If you're going to say we're using strictly rankings, then go with strictly rankings. And that one established ranking body, like, you don't need a committee. You don't need a committee other than to say, okay, 1 plays this team, 2 plays this team, 3 plays this team. For 1 through 8, you just figure out who they play in the next 8 or whatever it may be. But to me, if you're looking at it from the standpoint of we're looking at who wins the conference, it has to matter. It has to matter. I don't care if you were the best team all year and you find a way to lose and you don't make it into your conference title. That's what it's all about, if you ask me. A team that was able, like, take for instance, a team that, I don't know, like, Ohio State doesn't play for the conference championship, but yet they play for the national championship and win.
Right.
Like, to me, okay, we could say that Ohio State, in theory, was the best team all year, even though Oregon proved out to be the best team. I can't see myself taking away the value from Oregon winning the Big Ten because we're saying that this team over here, even though they lost and even lost to Oregon, is the best team in college football. Either you're going to honor who wins their conferences and say this is a way for us to differentiate these groups in the Power Four. They won their conference, they're in. Either we're going to differentiate it that way or we're going to say we're totally going to the ranking system. And if you go to the ranking system, you can't have all these different rankings out here, ratings or rankings of the teams. You can't have it.
But they don't factor in the coaches and AP and all that. Like, that's not, I mean, obviously the College Football Playoff Committee uses all the different analytics and they do factor in some of the different computer systems into their model and how they go about selecting. And in fact, like, I didn't mind the BCS. I actually thought the BCS system, which encompassed a lot, and there was a human element, there was a computer element. And what I liked about it the most, honestly, was the numbers. You could kind of see how far certain teams were behind. But for the most part, it's been pretty lock and step what the committee has picked. There's been a few differences over the years, but for the most part, like, it's been, in essence, an extension the committee has of the BCS. I would say with 90-some% accuracy based on what the BCS would have been. And that's ultimately what we go off of, at least in college football. Now, I think the next step moving forward, and it's too hard to do because you have too many teams. You know, and now maybe we get to a point where we do only have the Big Ten and SEC, and they kind of create their own level of play and scheduling and of format for determining the national champion, which I'm not trying to advocate for one way or another. But I'm saying if you're looking for a more fair model, it doesn't seem like we have an issue with the NFL's model for a playoff system. How we go about determining the winner of division, the winner of the ranking of as far as the conference, the team that gets the bye and so forth, 1 through 7, that would be where you ultimately want to get to. But part of the issue with that is one, the College Football Playoff Committee rankings don't come out till October. So if you're a TV network and you've paid all this money for the regular season, which all these networks have, you need something to sell them. It can't just be the brands themselves. Right? Even though Ohio State, Michigan will always be one of the highest rated games, it helps when they're 1 and 2, right? It helps when we feel like there's something on the line there for any of the matchups, any rivalry game, any of these Big Ten matchups or big time matchups. It helps when you have something to sell. And that's one of the reasons why the AP poll has continued to still be in existence. The coaches poll to some degree, but really most publications use the AP poll until you get to the college football playoff. Then there's that transition to everyone then using the college football playoff rankings, since they ultimately matter, as the ones that we use to kind of sell the game and sell the excitement, enthusiasm behind it, and why people should watch. So, unfortunately, we're not to a spot where I think we can remove rankings altogether. We probably never will because of the history behind it. But to me, at least, I do think being able to award, to your point, the teams that I think not only win their conference, if we're still doing conference championship games, but also the teams that should be, the top 4 ranked if we keep it at 12 and there's 4 buys. Like that ultimately should be how we go about reseeding this thing after it's all said and done before we play the playoff.